Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're plunging into a really significant and, frankly, quite a disturbing period in history.
We are. We're looking at the Dominican Republic under Rafael Trujillo's rule, which lasted from 1930 all the way to 1961, a long time.
And it's important right from the start to acknowledge just how serious this topic is. We're talking widespread brutality, oppression.
Oh, absolutely. Systematic oppression, deep-seated corruption, and just, well, truly shocking human rights violations. It's heavy stuff.
It really is. So our goal in this deep dive is to give you, our listeners, a clear but thorough understanding of this whole era. We want to unpack how Trujillo actually got into power.
Right. And the methods he used, pretty terrifying methods to keep that iron grip for so long.
And also the lasting impact, the long shadow his dictatorship cast over the Dominican Republic, which you can still kind of see today.
Yeah. And we'll be drawing on various sources for this accounts detailing his rise, how he built that totalitarian state, the political repression, the economic side of things.
The exploitation, yeah. And then, of course, his fall and the legacy he left behind.
Exactly. So consider this your mission, if you will, to quickly but really grasp this crucial period and, what it still means.
Okay, let's get into it then. Trujillo, Rafael Trujillo, born back in 1891, San Cristobal. Pretty humble start, wouldn't you say, for someone who became so infamous.
Definitely humble. By all accounts, nothing particularly remarkable about his early life. But then he joined the military, and that really changed everything.
That was a key moment.
Seems like it. He showed this incredible ambition, apparently, and crucially, a ruthlessness, a willingness to use extreme measures, which, well, got him promoted pretty quickly.
It makes you wonder, were there signs early on? Did people notice this ruthlessness back then in his early military days?
That's a really good question. The sources focus more on how quickly he rose, suggesting that ruthlessness was effective, at least.
And then there's the U.S. factor. The Marines leave in 1924. Creates a bit of a vacuum, right?
A huge vacuum. Yeah, the U.S. departure definitely destabilized things. Trujillo was commander of the National Guard at the time, which was, a very powerful position.
Perfectly placed then.
Exactly. He leveraged that control. The 1930 coup against President Vasquez, that was his big move. And the sources do hint at possible U.S. involvement, or at least
maybe turning a blind eye. Or continued economic ties despite knowing what he was like.
Something like that. It's suggested they might have prioritized stability or their own interests over concerns about his methods, especially early on. It certainly helped him consolidate power.
So almost overnight, this, relatively unknown military guy becomes the top dog. How did he lock that down so fast?
He moved incredibly quickly to build this cult of personality around himself. It wasn't just about power. It was about image.
The benefactor of the nation.
That's the one. He presented himself as this indispensable figure, and his image was just inescapable. Portraits everywhere, government buildings, schools lining the streets.
Wow, just constant reinforcement.
Total saturation. It was deliberate indoctrination. The message was, any prosperity, anything good, it comes from Trujillo, attributed directly to him.
But behind that image?
Behind the image was the iron fist, absolute control over the military and the police, especially the National Guard.
Right. The sources really hammer home the role of the National Guard. They weren't just soldiers.
Not at all. They were his personal enforcers, an instrument of terror, really, used for suppressing any dissent, intimidation, violence, which brings us to the really dark side.
Yeah, the systematic repression, the human rights abuses.
Yeah.
It's a lot to take in. Where do we even start?
Well, right from the beginning, he used assassinations and purges ruthlessly. Anyone seen as a threat, political rivals, even former allies who maybe fell out of favor, they were eliminated.
Just removed?
Yeah, no hesitation. But then you have events like the Parsley Massacre in 1937. That stands out even amidst the constant brutality.
El Corte. It sounds particularly chilling.
It was horrifyingly deliberate. In October 37, he ordered the mass killing of Haitians and Dominican Haitians living along the border. Just targeted killing on a massive scale.
And the numbers are just. Estimates range from 10,000 up to maybe 30,000 people.
Exactly. Tens of thousands. It's hard to even comprehend that scale. And the method they used to identify victims.
Forcing them to say Perishil parsley. And if they couldn't pronounce it the right way.
It was a death sentence, based purely on how they spoke a single word. It weaponized language itself, just shows the calculated cruelty involved.
Unbelievable. And the violence didn't stop with large-scale massacres. Individual acts, like the murder of the Mirabal sisters in 1959, They've become such icons.
They really have. Patria, Minerva, and Maria Teresa Mirabal, they were vocal opponents of the regime involved in the resistance.
And Trujillo couldn't tolerate that.
No. His agents ambushed and murdered them. And the plan backfired spectacularly. Instead of silencing opposition, their deaths created this huge wave of outrage, both domestically and internationally.
It galvanized people, didn't it?
Absolutely. They became martyrs, powerful symbols of courage and resistance against tyranny. Their legacy is immense.
Beyond these horrific, well-known events, what was daily life like? The constant suppression must have been suffocating.
Completely. Freedom of speech, non-existent. The media was heavily censored, just pumping out regime propaganda.
So you only heard the official story?
Pretty much. And if you were a journalist, an intellectual, anyone who dared to speak out, you faced arrest, torture, maybe even murder. He controlled the information flow completely.
What about institutions like the church? How did Trujillo deal with them? His relationship with the Catholic Church seems complicated.
Very complicated. He put on a public show of being devout, using it for legitimacy.
But clashed with them too?
Oh, definitely. If the church or individual priests criticized him or opposed his policies, he'd hit back hard. There were cases of clergy being persecuted, even killed. His support was purely conditional on whether they served his interests. Power was the only thing that mattered.
Which brings us to the economy. It sounds like he basically treated the Dominican Republic like his personal bank account.
That's not far off, honestly. The corruption was rampant. He accumulated just enormous personal wealth. By the time he was killed in 1961, estimates suggest he and his family controlled something like over half the entire country's economy.
Half the economy? How is that even possible? Sugar plantations, hotels, banks?
Factories, you name it. He had his fingers in everything. And it wasn't just him. His family members were given monopolies in key sectors. It was a system designed to enrich the Trujillos.
While most people lived in poverty.
Exactly. A huge, stark contrast. Widespread poverty for the majority, obscene wealth for the ruling family and their cronies.
And the land expropriation, taking land from people.
Systematically. Land was seized from individuals, communities, institutions, often with no compensation at all.
And given to
family members, loyal supporters in the military or government. It further cemented his control over resources and rewarded loyalty. His heavy involvement in the sugar industry, too, often came at the direct expense of the local population.
So this went on for decades. But by the 1950s, things started to shift, didn't they? His grip wasn't quite as absolute.
Right. Cracks started to appear. Domestically, there was growing opposition fueled by years of economic hardship and brutal repression. People were getting tired.
And
international pressure was mounting, too. Condemnation of the human rights abuses was getting louder. And as we mentioned, the Mirabal sisters' assassination in 1959 was a real catalyst. It significantly boosted resistance.
And then the end came quite suddenly. May 30th, 1961, his assassination.
Yes. It seems it was a well-planned operation. A group of conspirators involving people from the military, political opponents, even some linked to the church, people who had just had enough.
They ambushed him.
On a highway near his home, yeah.
Oh.
A coordinated attack that brought his 31-year reign to a very abrupt, violent end.
But his death wasn't the end of the story, was it? It didn't immediately lead to peace and democracy.
Not at all. The immediate aftermath was actually quite chaotic. Trujillo was gone. But the system he built, his network of loyalists, they were still there.
So instability.
Big time. It was a really difficult transition period. It eventually led to a civil war in 1965, factions fighting over the country's future, some pro-American, some still loyal to the Trujillo legacy, essentially.
And the U.S. intervened then, too.
They did. U.S. military intervention, which, further complicated the path towards establishing a stable democracy. It took time.
So decades later, how does the Dominican Republic grapple with this legacy? His shadow must still loom large.
It absolutely does. It's been a long, ongoing process, reckoning with the atrocities, trying to build democratic institutions on foundations that were so corrupted.
Honoring the victims must be a huge part of that.
Crucial. People like the Mirabal sisters are rightly remembered as national heroes, symbols of resistance. The National Day Against Violence Against Women, named in their honor, is a testament to that.
But the scars remain.
Deep scars, yes. The brutality, the corruption he embedded, the political repression, those things have had a lasting impact on the country's development, its politics, its society. It takes generations to really work through that kind of trauma.
So just to wrap up this deep dive, we've seen Trujillo's, ruthless climb to power, exploiting instability.
We've seen how he built this terrifying totalitarian state based on fear, propaganda, and absolute control.
We've touched on the horrific human rights abuses, the Parsley Massacre, the Mirabel Sisters, the everyday repression.
And the staggering economic exploitation, treating the nation as his personal fiefdom.
And finally, his eventual fall, but also the difficult, complex path the country faced afterwards in trying to find its way to democracy.
Exactly. And understanding this history isn't just academic, is it? It's vital. It really reminds you how fragile freedom can be.
And how important it is to be vigilant against tyranny.
Precisely. Trujillo is such a stark example of how absolute power corrupts, and the devastating impact that has on ordinary lives.
Absolutely. So on that rather sobering note, here's something for you, our listener, to think about. How do the echoes of regimes like Trujillo's linger in a society long after the dictator is gone?
Yeah. What are the subtle ways, maybe the not so subtle ways, a nation deals with a history of such brutality and oppression?
And what responsibility does each new generation have to truly make sure, that atrocities like these never, ever happen again? Thank you for taking this deep. Okay, let's talk about João Goulart, his presidency in Brazil.
Well, it's a really compelling story, isn't it? It ends so abruptly.
It really does. Not a slow fade, but this dramatic, kind of mysterious fall in 1964.
Yeah. Django, as people called him, Brazil's 24th president, and then boom, a military coup just 3 years in. It makes you wonder, what really went down?
Absolutely. And that's what we're trying to unpack in this deep dive. Goulart's fall wasn't just, a local Brazilian issue.
No, it feels bigger.
It is. It's a powerful example of how internal politics, domestic struggles can get tangled up with these huge global power plays.
Right. So our mission here is to look at this source material we have, this excerpt, and really explore that time, the forces at play, the key people.
And how the whole Cold War climate basically fueled the fire that ended Brazil's democratic run back then.
Exactly. This source gives us a good starting point, laying out Goulart's background. He wasn't your typical politician from the elite class. No, he came from the Brazilian Labor Party, the PTB, became president in 1961. It was after Jânio Quadros just suddenly resigned. Came out of nowhere for many.
And that labor background really shaped his presidency, didn't it? His focus was on workers' rights, social welfare.
Definitely. And that's where the trouble started, essentially. His ideas were progressive. Things like land reform, programs to tackle Brazil's massive inequality.
Which sounds good on paper, but
it seriously rattled the established powers. Yeah. Think about the military, the big agricultural landowners, the major business leaders. They saw this as a direct threat.
A threat to their control, their economic power.
Precisely, their political influence, too. And then you layer on the Cold War context.
Right. Anything remotely left-leaning immediately set off alarm bells, especially for the U.S. and its allies.
Deep suspicion. So, as our source points out, by 1964, the pressure on Goulart was immense. The economy wasn't doing great. There were more strikes, more protests.
It sounds like a perfect storm brewing.
It really was. And interestingly, his attempts to kind of navigate this, maybe find some middle ground, or even engage with left-wing factions.
That backfired.
It seemed to. It just heightened the fears among the military and the business elites. Even if he was trying to appear moderate, they started seeing him more and more as, well, a potential communist sympathizer.
It's like he was caught in a bind. Anything he did just fed the narrative against him.
Kind of, yeah. Which leads us to March 31st, 1964. The military launches the coup.
But the source says it wasn't just the military acting alone.
That's a really key point. There were civilian opposition groups backing it too, people genuinely worried about the country's direction under Goulart.
And the U.S. role. That always comes up.
Always. The source mentions U.S. officials were definitely worried. The fear was Brazil might become another Cuba.
A communist foothold in South America.
That was the nightmare scenario for Washington back then. And this question of U.S. involvement, it just hangs over the whole event.
Our source mentions declassified documents.
Yes. Showing that the U.S. government under LBJ offered support. Things like financial aid, intelligence, maybe even military resources to the opposition.
Wow. So not just watching from the sidelines.
It certainly suggests more than that. The CIA's exact role is, still debated by historians, but the evidence points to real communication. Active engagement between American officials and the Brazilian military leaders planning the coup.
So did they know it was coming?
Reports mentioned in the source suggest they did. Knew about the plans, even offered support to the officers involved.
And the justification was?
The belief that Goulart was leaning towards communism, that he was a risk despite his more moderate public stance. It was all seen through that Cold War prism,
So was it a purely Brazilian affair that the U.S. just happened to support? Or was there more active foreign involvement in making it happen? That's the big question, isn't it?
It is. And while the source points towards significant U.S. involvement, it also stresses we can't ignore the powerful domestic forces.
Right, the Brazilian elites themselves, the
Yeah.
business leaders, the landowners.
They weren't just sitting back, they were deeply alarmed by Goulart's ideas. Land reform, support for labor unions, this was terrifying to them.
And they were talking to the military.
Constantly in the months leading up, essentially creating the conditions, maybe even encouraging the military to step in. They saw the military as their guarantee against Goulart.
And the military had a history of intervening in politics in Brazil.
Oh, yes. Since the late 19th century, really, they saw this as a moment to, well, regain their dominance.
Under the guise of defending democracy?
That was the justification, yes. Quite ironic, considering they then established a dictatorship that lasted until 1985.
A brutal one, too. The source mentions repression, censorship.
Swift and brutal. Political opponents, activists, anyone seen as left-wing faced persecution. It shows the real goal wasn't saving democracy, but seizing control.
It really highlights those complex alliances, military, business, politics, all working together, shaping Brazil's future for decades.
And what happened to Goulart himself after the coup?
Well, he was forced into exile, moved around Uruguay, Argentina, Paraguay, back to Uruguay eventually.
Became a symbol of resistance, I suppose?
He did, for many, though the military regime worked hard to paint him as a communist collaborator, to tarnish his image.
Standard playbook. Discredit the ousted leader.
Exactly. He tried to get back to Brazil, apparently, but it never happened. He died in exile in 1976, living relatively quietly by then.
But his death, the source mentions some suspicion around it.
Yeah, that's another lingering question. Officially, it was a heart attack. But there have always been suspicions, theories that maybe he was poisoned.
By the regime.
By agents of the regime, yes. The idea being they still saw him as a threat, even in exile, someone who could rally opposition. So was it natural causes, or was it something more sinister, an assassination? We still don't definitively know.
It just adds another layer of tragedy to this story.
Definitely. And the source really emphasizes that Goulart's overthrow wasn't just about one man. It was a massive turning point for Brazil.
Absolutely. It ushered in this really dark period, 21 years of military rule, repression, state-sponsored violence.
The numbers are just staggering. Thousands tortured, disappeared, killed. It's chilling when you think about the human cost of these political shifts.
And you have to see it in the wider context, too, right? The Cold War playing out across Latin America.
Yeah, similar stories in Chile, Argentina, military coups, authoritarian regimes.
Often with varying levels of U.S. backing or knowledge. Brazil's coup was part of that larger tragic pattern in the region during that time.
So that period ending only in 1985, it just shows how deep the impact of 64 was. Goulart's fall really was this pivotal, painful moment.
No doubt about it. It fundamentally altered Brazil's path for decades.
So wrapping this up, it seems clear the fall of João Goulart wasn't simple. It was this potent mix of Brazil's own internal conflicts.
Deep class tensions, political rivalries.
Right. All massively amplified by the Cold War. The global ideological battle basically landed right in Brazil.
And you had this convergence. The military wanting power back, the elites terrified of losing their status, and the U.S. determined to stop anything it saw as left-wing influence nearby.
These weren't separate forces. They formed alliances. The source makes that clear. Military, business, maybe foreign powers all aligning.
It really exposes the sometimes brutal realities of political power, how fragile democracy can be when faced with that kind of opposition, both inside and out.
Goulart's story is just a stark reminder, isn't it? The human cost, the danger of foreign interference, the need to constantly safeguard democratic systems.
And thinking about this deep dive, maybe the question to leave you, the listener, with is this. Considering what happened in Brazil and maybe in other countries with similar histories, what are the long-term effects when power becomes so unbalanced? When systems become vulnerable to these kinds of internal and external pressures, it feels incredibly relevant, even to
Simon Bolivar. El Libertador. We all sort of have this picture, right?
Yeah.
The great hero freeing South America, almost mythical.
Yeah, absolutely. But what if that picture, that iconic image, it kind of hides a much more complex reality?
Exactly. What if his amazing success wasn't just built on, lofty ideals, but also on some pretty surprising strategies, maybe even unsettling ones.
That's what's so interesting here, I think, peeling back those layers. Because,
Yeah.
yes, he was undeniably huge, transformative. But when you really start digging into how he did it, you get a much more nuanced picture, contradictory even at times.
Right. Because this deep dive, it isn't about just repeating the history book version. We've got some really compelling stuff here that makes you look past the legend to understand this, like the actual nuts and bolts of his revolution. What were those crucial tactics? The ones that were maybe deeply controversial that let one guy liberate so much land. That's really what we want to explore.
And, to really get those tactics, you have to start with the man himself. Bolivar. He wasn't, born a revolutionary figure.
No.
His early life, wealthy Creole family in Venezuela, born 1783.
That gave him privilege, sure, but it also put him right there, seeing the growing unhappiness with Spanish rule.
Okay, so when you say Creole here, for listeners.
Right, good point. We mean someone of European descent, but born in the Americas. They often had money, social standing, but crucially, they were shut out of the very top jobs by the Spanish colonial system.
Gotcha. So a comfortable life, but still limited by the system.
Yeah.
And then he goes to Europe, gets exposed to the Enlightenment. That must have been huge for him.
Oh, absolutely huge. Reading thinkers like Rousseau, Locke, all about popular sovereignty, natural rights. It gave him the intellectual framework for revolution, didn't it?
Yeah.
And then seeing Napoleon in Paris, witnessing that kind of radical change driven by one person's will, plus the personal stuff, losing his parents young.
Yeah.
It seems like all that just fueled his convictions, made him almost unstoppable.
So it's a real journey then, from maybe just wanting more, say, like other Creoles, to this massive vision. A united, powerful South America. That's quite a shift.
A huge shift. And that kind of ambition needed more than just ideas. It needed a really specific, often innovative way of fighting.
Against the Spanish Empire.
Yeah.
Right. Not exactly pushovers.
And not at all. He couldn't just raise a bigger army.
Yeah.
So this is where his genius for guerrilla warfare really shines.
Using the Andes.
Exactly. Using the terrain, hiding, disrupting supply lines, quick ambushes, using local knowledge. It basically canceled out Spain's advantage in numbers and traditional military power.
It sounds like the classic underdog playbook, but on a massive scale. He mastered it. But it wasn't just fighting, was it? He also had this knack for making alliances, even if it was tricky.
Oh, remarkably so. And sometimes ruthlessly so. As you say, he knew a divided movement would just get crushed. So his ability to bring together different local leaders, even guys who hated each other or had totally different goals.
That was amazing.
How did he do that? Promises. A mix of things. Diplomacy, sure. Strategic marriages sometimes. And definitely, crucially, promises of autonomy for the regions later on.
But the sources we're looking at suggest these weren't exactly stable partnerships. They call them fragile and self-serving. Sounds like walking a tightrope.
It absolutely was. How did he keep them together? Well, take someone like José Antonio Páez in Venezuela. Bolivar basically said, okay, you run things here, just give me your troops. He recognized Páez's power.
Even if their long-term goals maybe didn't align.
Exactly. They were tactical deals, alliances of necessity. Bolivar made calculated compromises for immediate military wins, figuring he'd sort out the politics later.
And sometimes that meant turning on people. The sources mentioned betrayal. San Martin, for example.
Yes, that's a really complex one. His relationship with José de San Martin, their approaches, their ambitions, they clashed. And their eventual split, you could argue, it weakened the overall revolutionary cause in the long run. Trust was definitely impacted.
Okay, so we've got the unconventional fighting, these flexible alliances. But Bolivar also seemed to get that this was a mental game too, right? Psychology mattered.
Oh, hugely. He was a master of what we'd call psychological warfare. Propaganda. He really understood symbols, image.
El Libertador.
Precisely. That wasn't just a nickname someone gave him. It was a brand, carefully built, carefully spread to inspire people, make them loyal.
He was the revolution, in a way. And how he framed it, not just about land or politics, but this divine mission, a moral fight for the future of Latin Americans. That's powerful stuff.
Incredibly powerful. His speeches, his writings, they're filled with these soaring ideals, a unified, just prosperous South America. It gave people something huge to believe in, something worth dying for.
Across different classes, too, presumably.
Yes, it tapped into really deep hopes. The big challenge, though, was making those beautiful words into actual working governments.
Which leads us to the harder parts, because the sources don't shy away from it. There's a darker side here. Terror, ruthlessness.
Yeah, and this is something we have to confront, even if it's uncomfortable. Bolivar could be incredibly harsh when he felt he needed to be, to solidify control, crush opposition.
Like the executions in Bogota.
Exactly. After retaking the city in 1816, the mass executions of royalist soldiers, even sympathizers, it's a stark example of his willingness to use extreme force against perceived enemies.
Chilling.
It's
And not just soldiers, right? The sources mention scorched earth tactics, burning villages.
Yes, in places like Peru, Colombia, villages suspected of helping the Spanish, that kind of brutality feels totally opposed to the liberator image, doesn't it?
It really does. How did he justify that?
The justification usually was that it was a necessary evil, regrettable, but needed for the ultimate victory for the future republic. But the sources also hint that these very tactics often turned local people against him, so distrust.
Which perhaps connects to his biggest dream, this united Latin America, Grand Colombia, Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, Panama, all one big nation, kind of like the U.S.
It was an incredibly bold vision, yeah. Inspired by the Enlightenment, wanting to create this powerful bloc against Europe. But he maybe didn't fully grasp how strong the regional loyalties were.
People didn't just want freedom from Spain, they wanted their own freedom, not just swapping one master for another, even a revolutionary one.
Pretty much. Local leaders who'd fought for independence weren't eager to just hand over power to a central figure, even Bolivar. And his leadership style didn't always help.
How so?
Well, the sources suggest he became increasingly authoritarian. He tried to impose his vision rather than building consensus, which, ironically, probably fueled the very divisions he wanted to overcome.
So his attempts to hold it all together actually helped pull it apart.
You could definitely argue that. His reliance on a tight inner circle, his impatience with dissent, it all contributed. By 1830, Venezuela and Ecuador had split off. The dream of unity just fractured.
And all that pressure, the fighting, the politics, seeing his big dream crumble, it must have taken a huge personal toll. The sources talk about insecurities, paranoia later on.
Yes, it seems the relentless strain really affected him psychologically. He became more secretive, more suspicious, even of close allies. It suggests a man just worn down by it all, burdened by the weight of it, maybe haunted by some of the choices he'd made.
It makes the end of his story feel almost tragic. He resigns in 1830, forced out, feeling bitter like a failure. This guy who freed nations ends up disillusioned, isolated.
It's incredibly poignant, and it leaves us with this legacy that people still argue about today, don't they?
Totally. Hero or tyrant?
Right. Was he the visionary liberator whose dream of unity still inspires? Or was he ruthless, authoritarian, someone whose own flaws helped create instability in the nations he founded?
And the answer is probably complicated. Somewhere in between.
I think that's usually the case with figures like this. You can't deny his role in independence, the power of his vision, but you also can't ignore the brutality, the manipulation, the authoritarian streak that undermined his own goals.
The cost of liberation was immense.
Yeah.
For everyone involved, including Bolivar himself.
Absolutely. His story is such a powerful reminder that revolutions are messy. Achieving noble goals often involves, morally gray choices. And those choices have long-lasting consequences.
So as you, our listener, think about Bolivar, maybe ask yourself this. Can a leader really build lasting unity using methods that are, by their nature, divisive? Or maybe how do we reconcile these heroic stories of liberation with the often brutal reality of how it happened?
Yeah, and how did those contradictions shape Latin America afterwards? It's a legacy that's so much more complex than just the statue in the town square. It really forces you to look deep. Hi there! You're listening because you want to cut through the noise on complex topics, right? Get right to the core.
Exactly. And today, we're diving into Venezuela under Nicolas Maduro, looking at the period since 2013.
It's been, a tumultuous time, to say the least.
We've gone through a lot of reports, analyses, trying to pull out the really critical allegations surrounding his rule.
Our mission here is simple. Give you a clear, concise picture. Human rights, the economy, international stuff, all of it.
We're looking at alleged crackdowns, the economic freefall, accusations of serious international crimes, even things like drug trafficking links.
And how the world reacted. So let's jump in. Where do we start with the human rights situation? What are the sources telling us?
Well, the consistent theme across different human rights groups is an increasingly authoritarian environment.
Authoritarian how?
Basically, allegations that the government systematically used its power to crush dissent, to silence opposition.
Okay, and the big protests, like in 2014, 2017, those were major flashpoints, weren't they? Driven by the economy getting worse.
They were huge.
Yeah.
And not just small protests. These were widespread. And the response, according to reports, was often brutal.
Brutal like.
We're talking excessive force. Reports detailing use of live ammunition, not just rubber bullets or tear gas, plus, mass arrests.
Wow.
And very serious allegations of torture and even extrajudicial killings by security forces.
That's incredibly heavy. And it wasn't just protesters on the street, right? Opposition leaders were targeted, too. People like Lopez, Machado, Capriles.
Yes, absolutely. They often come up in these reports. It seems like a pattern of threats, sometimes imprisonment, sometimes being forced into exile.
So using the state apparatus against political opponents.
That's the allegation, yeah. Kind of weaponizing the legal system itself to sideline critics.
And these weren't just internal complaints. International groups were watching.
Oh, definitely. Big names like Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International.
Yeah.
They've issued some really strong condemnations.
Calling it systematic abuse.
Pretty much. Systematic violations of basic civil political rights. And you also had the UN, the Organization of American States, the OAS, expressing serious concern, calling for investigations.
So widespread international alarm bells ringing.
You could say that. It shows how seriously the global community viewed the situation.
Okay, let's pivot then. From human rights to the economy, it's still kind of mind-blowing. Venezuela, with all that oil wealth, how did it collapse so spectacularly?
It really is a stark case study, isn't it? It shows how, mismanagement and crucially alleged corruption can just gut even a resource-rich country.
Corruption is a key theme in the source.
Yes, huge theme. Widespread embezzlement of public funds is cited as a major driver of the crisis.
And PDVSA, the state oil company, that seems to be ground zero for a lot of this.
It does. The scale of alleged corruption there is.
Oh, it's massive.
You've got high-ranking officials indicted overseas, in the U.S., in Europe.
And that directly impacted oil production, the country's main income source.
Catastrophically, yeah. Production plummeted. It created this, vicious cycle. Corruption hits revenue, which worsens the crisis, which maybe fuels more desperation.
And the numbers themselves are hard to grasp. Hyperinflation over 1,000,000% in 2018. What does that even mean for someone living through it?
It means chaos, basically. Imagine your money becoming worthless almost hourly, prices changing constantly, needing wheelbarrows of cash for groceries, if you could even find them.
Just impossible to live normally.
Completely destabilizing. Forget planning for the future. And then you have the GDP shrinking by over 70%.
70%. What does that look like on the ground?
It means businesses shutting down everywhere. Massive unemployment, way beyond official stats, whole industries just vanishing, less money, fewer opportunities, a drastic drop in living standards for almost everyone.
Leading to the widespread poverty and scarcity we heard so much about.
Exactly. Lack of food, medicine, clean water. That became the tragic reality for millions. It's a fundamental breakdown.
And essential services like hospitals, schools.
Also devastated, according to the reports. Hospitals lacking basic supplies, medicine. Schools without resources, teachers struggling.
The long-term damage from that must be immense.
Absolutely. It erodes the foundation of the society for years to come. Which brings us to another really grim aspect, the accusations of crimes against humanity.
These are extremely serious charges, international criminal court level stuff.
They are. And the ICC did open investigations. It shows the gravity. These aren't just allegations of, say, mismanagement. They're about systematic attacks on civilians.
Stemming from the crackdown on protests and treatment of opponents?
Largely, yes. Things like the alleged extrajudicial killings we mentioned earlier. Reports talk about death squads, paramilitary groups targeting opponents.
It sounds terrifyingly systematic.
That's the core of the accusation. And then there's torture. Widespread reports from inside prisons, beatings, psychological abuse, denying medical care, specifically targeting political prisoners, activists, journalists.
Just brutal.
And arbitrary detention, too.
Yeah.
Just locking people up without due process,
right,
seemingly as a political tool to instill fear and silence opposition.
Right. And the humanitarian crisis itself plays into this, doesn't it? There's debate about sanctions versus government policy, but the government's response.
Well, the sources often point to the government's initial refusal to accept large-scale international aid or mismanagement of the aid that did come in. Regardless of the causes of the shortages, the response is part of the critique.
And the result was millions fleeing the country.
A massive exodus. People just looking for basic survival, safety. It's one of the largest displacement crises in the world,
Just devastating. Okay, another layer here. Alleged links to drug trafficking and organized crime.
Yeah, this adds a whole other dimension. Very serious allegations about government involvement.
The term narco-estado, a narco-state, gets thrown around a lot. What does that actually imply in this context?
It implies, especially from the U.S. government perspective, that it's not just isolated corruption, but that parts of the state apparatus are deeply involved in drug trafficking.
Like facilitating it.
Allegedly facilitating it, yeah. The big example cited is the 2020 U.S. indictment of Maduro himself and several high-ranking officials.
What were they indicted for?
Conspiracy to traffic cocaine into the U.S.
Well, yeah.
Basically accusing them of using state resources, planes, ports, you name it, to help move drugs.
That's a bombshell accusation. Suggests a systemic problem, not just a few bad apples.
Exactly. It implies that illicit activities are intertwined with state power, which makes tackling it incredibly difficult.
And there are also alleged ties to groups like the FARC in Colombia or even Hezbollah. What's the supposed logic there?
The reports suggest a few potential reasons. Maybe financial gain from illicit activities, maybe protection like these groups offer a buffer, or maybe it's about projecting influence in the region. It's a murky web of alleged alliances.
Okay, so let's shift again to how Maduro actually held on to power through all this. Political manipulation, electoral fraud, these accusations keep coming up.
They're central to understanding his longevity, yes. The claim is that democratic processes were systematically undermined.
It started right away, didn't it? The 2013 election after Chavez died.
Immediately contentious. Maduro claimed a narrow victory over Henry Capriles, but the opposition cried foul straight away. Alleged irregularities, manipulation. It set a precedent.
But the 2018 election seemed like a real turning point internationally.
Oh, absolutely. That election, where Maduro won a second term, was widely condemned as fraudulent, not just by the opposition, but by many, many countries.
What were the specific complaints?
Widespread claims of vote rigging, messing with voter rolls, intimidation. Basically, that it wasn't a free or fair contest by any stretch.
And that led to much greater international isolation. Sanctions, non-recognition.
Exactly. That's when you saw the U.S., the EU, many Latin American nations really ramp up the pressure. And it led to some countries recognizing Juan Guaido as the interim president.
A really complex diplomatic situation.
Very complex. And it highlighted the deep divisions, not just within Venezuela, but internationally, on how to handle the situation.
So let's talk more about that global response. It wasn't uniform, but it was largely critical.
Overwhelmingly critical from Western democracies and many neighbors, yeah. Lots of condemnation, calls for change.
The U.S. was particularly active with sanctions, right?
Very active,
Yeah.
targeting the oil sector, finance, key government officials personally, including Maduro. And as we said, the diplomatic move of recognizing Guaido was significant, even if it didn't ultimately shift power.
What about other major players? The UN, Latin America.
The UN kept calling for investigations, access for human rights monitors, highlighting the humanitarian crisis and abuses. Within Latin America, you had the Lima Group, countries like Colombia, Brazil, Argentina, Peru at the time, formed specifically to pressure for a democratic transition.
So a fairly broad coalition pushing back.
A broad coalition, yes, though not unanimous globally, but significant international pressure, definitely.
Okay, so wrapping this up, it's a really stark picture we painted based on these reports. Serious human rights violations, economic collapse fueled by alleged corruption and mismanagement.
Potential crimes against humanity being investigated, worrying links to drug trafficking and organized crime, and a political system allegedly held together by fraud and manipulation. It's a lot.
And the constant backdrop is this intense international scrutiny and condemnation.
Right. Whatever angle you look at it from, Maduro's rule has been marked by deep crisis and intense controversy.
It really makes you think about Venezuela's future. Where does it go from here? The path towards accountability, towards recovery, it seems incredibly challenging.
It really does. And it forces you to consider, the human cost when systems break down like this, and the complexities of international intervention versus sovereignty.
It's a sobering reminder of how high the stakes can be.
Definitely. A situation with lessons far beyond Venezuela's borders.
Absolutely. We really encourage you, our listeners, to keep exploring this topic. Look at the different perspectives because it's far from simple, and the story for the Venezuelan people is far from over.
Bonjour et bienvenue. Aujourd'hui, on examine de près une période sombre de l'histoire guatémaltèque.
Oui. Le régime d'Ephraim Ríos Montt.
Exactement, entre 1982 et 1983. On va essayer de décrypter son arrivée au pouvoir, ses méthodes.
Des méthodes très dures, oui.
Et puis l'impact durable, sans oublier le rôle des États-Unis dans tout ça, en pleine guerre froide.
Tout à fait. Alors, Ríos Montt, il arrive comment ?
Par un coup d'État, en mars 82.
D'accord.
Le pays était déjà en pleine guerre civile depuis des décennies. Lui prend la tête d'une junte militaire.
Une junte, donc un gouvernement militaire.
Voilà. Et faut voir que pour Washington, pour Reagan à l'époque,
Oui.
il était vu un peu comme un rempart contre le communisme en Amérique centrale. Donc il a eu un certain soutien, disons. Et nous, les sources parlent d'un ciblage particulier des Mayas.
Exactement. L'idée, c'était de couper la guérilla de ses soutiens supposés. Et l'armée pensait que les communautés mayas, surtout dans certaines régions comme l'Ixil, aidaient les rebelles. Alors, la méthode, c'était terrible.
Les sources décrivent des massacres.
Des massacres systématiques, oui. Des villages entiers rasés, la torture, les viols comme armes de guerre.
C'est effroyable.
Oui. Le massacre de Dossers, par exemple, en décembre 82. Plus de 200 personnes, hommes, femmes, enfants. Tués méthodiquement.
Méthodiquement.
L'administration Reagan a privilégié la lutte anticommuniste. Le soutien, militaire notamment, a continué, avec des débats à Washington, mais il a continué.
Ça montre le poids de la géopolitique, quoi.
Exactement. Le coût humain de cette logique de bloc.
Mais ce régime si brutal, il ne dure pas si longtemps. Il est renversé en août 83.
Oui, assez vite finalement. C'est surtout dû à des luttes de pouvoir dans l'armée.
Ah, d'accord.
Son style autocratique, ses prêches religieux à la télé, ça a fini par lasser au sein même de l'armée. Peut-être aussi un peu de pression internationale, mais moins décisive, d'après les sources.
Et après sa chute, la justice, ça a été un chemin très long.
Très long.
Avec ce moment fort en 2013, le procès.
Oui, ce procès historique.
Condamné pour génocide et crimes contre l'humanité, c'était une première mondiale, un ex-chef d'État jugé comme ça, dans son pays.
Mais voilà, coup de théâtre, la condamnation est annulée quelques jours après. Vice de procédure, soi-disant.
Une décision très controversée, j'imagine.
Extrêmement. Un coup dur pour les victimes.
Et au final, il meurt en 2018.
C'est ça, à 91 ans. Sans condamnation définitive. Un autre procès était en cours, mais très lent.
Donc son héritage, c'est cette violence extrême, cette terreur d'État, et puis une impunité judiciaire finalement.
C'est un peu ça, oui. Violence ciblée, surtout contre les Mayas, et une justice qui n'a pas pu aller jusqu'au bout.
Alors qu'est-ce qu'on retient de tout ça? Clairement un traumatisme immense au Guatemala.
Immense, oui. Surtout pour les communautés victimes. Des divisions qui restent.
Des blessures pas refermées, et puis ça montre les dangers d'un pouvoir militaire sans contrôle.
Tout à fait. Et si on élargit un peu, ça montre comment des conflits locaux peuvent être terriblement aggravés par les enjeux internationaux. La guerre froide ici.
Et l'échec final de la justice pose la question comment une société se reconstruit après ça. C'est très compliqué. Et ça nous amène à une dernière réflexion, peut-être, au-delà de Rios Montt lui-même. Qu'est-ce que cette histoire nous dit sur les mécanismes politiques, militaires, internationaux qui permettent à une telle violence de se produire?
Oui. Comment ça devient possible?
Et comment une nation peut affronter ce passé quand la justice institutionnelle peine à donner toutes les réponses?
Voilà. De quoi continuer à